Hi, my name is Andy Petrie and I'm Director of Systems and Safety Assurance at Arch. Today I'm going to be going through the second in a series of videos I've produced talking about Reasonably Practicable and how that relates to both ALARP and SFAIRP and how we apply that in practice when we're making decisions about how we comply with the law. This is actually a second in a series of videos that I've made. The first one I produced last year based on a presentation I gave at the Osrail conference. That video can be found using the link below, and I'll pin that into the comments. So if you haven't seen the video, I'd suggest you have a look at it beforehand because a few of the concepts I'm going to talk about today are covered in there. It's not essential, but it would be useful to help you with how we're going to move through the slides going forward. I always like to start any presentation with this slide, which I've taken from a slide that Greg Smith gave to Engineers Australia a few years ago. It's important that we understand what reasonably practicable means before we really progress into any of the later parts of this presentation. Reasonably practicable is a defined legal term. What this means is the courts and the people who work in the courts, the lawyers, solicitors, know what this term means. It's been used in case law for probably 60, 70, 80 years now, and it's not really up for debate what it actually means. There's obviously case law where it's tested and sometimes it's refined as to what that actually means. But we have to understand this isn't something that's made up by me. It doesn't matter what your views or opinions are or book you read. Reasonably practicable is defined by the courts. The terms that we use most often in safety are so far as reasonably practicable, and this is used in most of the legislation, not all the legislation, but most of the legislation. The term SFARP you'll hear a lot, or as low as reasonably practicable, ALARP again, a term that we use when we're really focusing on what the risk is rather than management of safety. Both of these terms provide context to what reasonably practicable is. They do not change the legal meaning and the legal definition, and it's really important that we understand that. We don't have views on what this means. Reasonably practicable is defined and understood by the courts. This is a slide from my previous presentation, which I mentioned earlier. It's a visual way that I use to show, well, what is reasonably practicable? If you go back to the original case law and in fact the wording in some of the current legislation, reasonably practicable is a judgment. It's a computation where on one side we put the quantum of risk benefit that can be achieved by a control, and on the other side we put the sacrifice in terms of time, trouble, and money that that control would take to implement it. And then we make a judgment call of whether the benefit is equal to or greater than the sacrifice it would take. This graph shows on the left, there's that very steep angle where the benefit is significantly greater than the sacrifice. If there's a control that meets that criteria, we would implement it to get to the reasonably practicable point. The right-hand side of the graph there, the sacrifice is much, much greater than the risk benefit. So in those positions, we would say we're not going to implement those controls because actually it's no longer reasonably practicable to do so. That inflection point between the two is where the reasonably practicable area sits. That's what you want to get to. That's what you want to achieve going forward. Now, that star I showed on the previous slide, it's not a fixed point. There's no hard and fast definition of what reasonably practical is. There's a bit of flexibility there. There's a bit of judgment that can be taken in. So in this graph, I'm going to show it as a zone. I'm going to call that green part the reasonably practicable zone. We'll have a look at the right now. I'm going to put in a little bit more context, which we'll use going forward. So we've got the reasonably practicable zone. That's what we have to do to satisfy the law. So if you're above that, if you're in that area where it's red and there's actually controls that can be implemented where the benefits outweigh the sacrifice, then you've not yet achieved reasonably practicable. So you have to do more to get into that zone. Conversely, and I think this is what a lot of people miss, is that actually you can go beyond reasonably practicable. There's a point where you can do things, but you don't need to do them under the law. You can choose to do them if you want to. And I'm going to call this area beyond reasonably practicable, and it's going to be that orange color going forward. So in the next few slides, we're just going to talk about how we consider those zones in practice and how they relate to things they're going to deal with every day as we go through our day jobs. So as we said earlier, we've got those three zones, which I mentioned in the previous slides. If you're in that red zone, you just can't be there. It's not negotiable. This is how the law works. You cannot be in the red zone. You have not yet satisfied reasonably practical. You must do more. You must be in that green zone. That's what we talk about when we say you must satisfy reasonably practicable. That's your legal duty. You must get in there. And again, that final zone there, you can choose to be there. You can choose to do more than the law considers reasonably practicable. But the law does not require you to do that. That is a personal choice that you make. Often when you see these terms referred to in case law, they use the term should and could. You should do what is reasonably practicable to get into that green zone. You could do more, but you don't have to do more. So when we talk about ALARP, we're talking about risk. So I'm going to show you how this works when we talk about ALARP and how that fits together. The axis here is the one on the left, and we're going to have that high risk on the left, on the top, and low risk on the bottom. Because ALARP, we're talking about quantum of risk itself. So again, let's apply those terms that we talked about in the previous graph and what that means means for us. So if you're in the not yet reasonably practical zone, you have to go lower. You have to make your risk lower than it is to get to reasonably practicable. So let's take a simple way of phrasing that. You're higher than the reasonably practicable risk. If you go to reasonably practicable, if you reduce your risk, you make it lower, you've actually achieved as low as reasonably practicable. You are a law. That's what you're required to do in law. You could theoretically then go lower than that. You could go lower than reasonably practicable. But again, that's a could, not a should. So again, in terms of the reasonably practicable and the terms that we use as low as reasonably practicable, it's about getting the risk low enough that it meets that band as low as. If we flip it over and we're going to talk about SFAIRP, we're managing risk. This is the duty to manage safety. So the axis we're going to use here is less safe to more safe. Applying those same criteria again, you have to go so far because that's what the law says. It's talked about go so far as. If you're in that top zone where you've not yet achieved reasonably practicable, we would say you're not yet so far as reasonably practicable. If you've got to that zone, you've gone as far as reasonably practicable. So that's the term, so far as is reasonably practicable, applies to getting into that green zone. If you go beyond that, if you choose to, you've gone further than reasonably practicable. So you've gone beyond that point where we would say you've satisfied the law, you've gone over and above what the law requires you to do. Next, I want to talk about some simple things called risk acceptance principles. When we're determining how we accept a risk, and we're talking about risk acceptance principles here, not quantums of risk and those kind of things, that's a different conversation. We're not going to cover that here. The risk acceptance principles are well accepted and understood by the regulators, and again by most of the case law that we talk about. There's 3 of those risk acceptance principles, and they focus largely on the application of good practice, and where there's no good practice, then you do a risk assessment which follows that. Most standards use these ones now. So first of all, we decide what controls we want by working out if there's a relevant standard. If there is a relevant standard, we consider that to be good practice and we implement it. I'll show you again how that works on some of the following slides. If there's no relevant standard, or there's actually, in this case, there's a reference system which is more applicable, we will compare it to a suitable reference system. If there's a suitable reference system, we consider that to be good practice and we implement the controls in line with that reference system. If there is no good practice, that is to say there's no relevant standards and there's no suitable reference system, then and only then do we do a risk assessment to determine what is reasonably practicable, doing the calculations ourselves. Now, those risk assessments can be qualitative, using a matrix or just a straightforward high, medium, low, or whatever approach you use, or a quantitative risk assessment where we actually do the calculations. The important thing here is you do them in that order. Risk assessment is only done where there is no good practice in place. What we're actually referring to here is not about accepting a risk as such, but determining what controls should be applied to satisfy reasonably practicable. Once we've applied the relevant set of controls, we can decide that we reduce the risk of ALARP or manage safety SFAIRP, whichever of those terms we're using. So first of all, we're going to consider good practice as it relates to relevant standards. Now, I'm not going to get into what considered relevant here. I've done some articles on LinkedIn. If you want to have a look at those, we can post some of the links in the comments below. So if we have a standard which is considered to be relevant, then you comply with the controls in the standard, and that's it. That's how you demonstrate you're satisfied reasonably practicable. And if you look at the context of those other zones, if you're in the area where you're red, there's controls in the standard that you haven't applied, then you have to apply them. You have to get into that reasonably practicable zone by applying the controls in the relevant standard. Conversely, you can go beyond that. You can implement more controls, but you don't have to under the law. You've satisfied reasonably practicable by complying with the standard itself, and you don't have to do that additional stuff. With standards, there's always a little bit of flexibility, and most processes have a way of having a non-compliance with the standard where, say, there's a little bit of flexibility, some margin of safety is being built into the standard. And under some circumstances, you can then risk assess a slightly less strict control, but within a degree of reason and following a very strict control process to do that. The other approach to good practice is reference systems. Now, I'm not going to go into specifics about what reference systems are here. Again, there's LinkedIn profile posts if you want to follow that up. A simple way of understanding what a reference is by looking at what your industry peers do. I use the term industry peer as an organization similar to yours that's doing the same thing, managing risks in a similar way, same pass-through exposure. When you look across industry, you'll be able to see people doing things in different ways. Most of them will be doing things in a very similar way. So again, looking at the example I've got here, company A, B, C, and D are all doing things in a very similar way. So we could consider this a reference system zone. If we're doing what those companies are doing, we're going to be doing what is reasonably practicable. In this example, I've got company E. Company E might be a bit of an outlier. It might be a legacy system where actually they were doing things 30, 40 years ago, and actually they haven't moved on because they're using a previous approach. Again, this happens a lot in the railways. And you may have an outlier here like company F, where they've decided to go way beyond what is reasonably practicable, and that's their choice. And over time, that might actually become the way everyone works. But as we are in industry now, we're actually focusing on what the majority of our peers are doing, companies A to D in this example here. So we've identified what reference systems are and what reasonably practical is. So we need to be doing something similar to what companies A, B, C, and D are doing. We do that, we can say we are doing what is reasonably practical. So again, if you're not doing what they're doing, you can't come along and say, I'm going to build a railway the same way that London Underground built a railway 100 years ago, because that's not going to fly anymore. We have to look at similar processes where we're using them right now. Same way as we did with standards, you don't have to do more than what your peers are doing. Your industry peers have set the reasonably practicable reference system basis, and you just need to do that. You can choose to do more, but the law does not require it of you. Where we have no good practice, where we've got no relevant standards or applicable reference systems, then we move on to the risk assessment. Risk assessment is where we have to determine what that reasonable practical is for what our risks are. Say on this example, we start at the left and we have a control A. We've assessed control A. We've determined that the risk benefits are actually much, much greater than the sacrifice. So we implement control A. We then do look at control B. Again, the benefits are significantly greater than the sacrifice. So we implement control B. We then get to control C and we say, you know what, we actually think here the sacrifice is significantly greater than the risk benefit. So we decide not to implement that. So what we do is we stop at that point C. This is actually a relatively straightforward approach to most work health safety risks, and it's based on individuals' judgment. However, if you're looking at a high hazard facility or a regulated industry, we might take a system safety approach to this and actually look at lots and lots of applicable potential controls using cost benefit analysis to determine if they're required or not. So once we've identified where that reasonably practicable is, we can stop. We have to get to that position where we've worked out what it is. In this example here, we have to adopt controls A and B to get us into that zone. But we've determined that we don't need to implement control C. That's taken us beyond what would be considered reasonably practicable. We will do another video on risk assessments at some point to get into that into more detail. I guess when we're looking at this, one of the most common mistakes is people just don't know when to stop. They do a risk assessment, they keep focusing down and down and down, and we'll look at an example of how this goes a bit wrong later on. But once you're satisfied that you've done what is reasonably practicable, you can stop and you don't have to justify what's doing not doing more. In order to best understand good practice, I find it's good to go through a worked example, so we'll do that on the next few slides. The scenario I'm going to work through here is how do we work out how many fire escapes we should have for a building. On the screen there, you see that coloured box. That's our building. It's a transport building. So let's say it's a tourist information office, the coffee stand and a waiting room. There's no high risk activities going on in there. There's no shops, no machinery, there's no storage of flammable materials. The building is 100 meters long by 15 meters wide, and it's contained on 3 sides, so we can't get out of 3 sides of the building. How do we work out how many fire exits would be reasonably practicable for this building? In Australia, this is relatively straightforward. We have the National Construction Code, or sometimes known as the Building Code of Australia. This describes the number of fire exits that are required for most buildings, and that is what's considered to be the good practice and therefore the reasonably practical solution. They have a Category 9B building, which is a transport building, and that meets our criteria, and that says at no point on a floor must be more than 20 meters from an exit. So doing some simple calculations, we can show, again, looking below, if we put 5 exits in there, again, these aren't to scale, obviously, then we could satisfy the requirement of the building code and actually say we've done what is reasonably practicable. In this second example, someone has proposed that we put in more fire escapes. They could theoretically reduce the risk and they don't cost that much more, but how far do you go and when do you decide to stop? In this example, we've put fire escapes every 10 meters apart. We could put them every 8 meters apart, every 5 meters apart. We could effectively have a consistent fire escapes through the entire building. But why should you do that is the question. The National Construction Code clearly says that you should have access from 20 meters from every part of the building. And the previous example satisfied that with 5 fire doors. You can choose to do this if you want to, but the law does not require it of you. In example 3, we've not yet reasonably practicable. In this case, someone has done a risk assessment and said, hey, the fire risk is really, really low. Why don't we just have 2 emergency exits instead? That'll save us a little bit of money. And you know what? The risk doesn't really change that much. Well, this would save money, but the solution would not satisfy the law. The reasonably practicable control is defined in the National Construction Code. And as I say, that's applied in example 1. You could propose this, but it would not fly under the law. If you tried this, you'd get prosecuted as not being reasonably practicable. If there is a standard, you must follow it. You can't risk assess yourself out of those kind of things. So just following on from those 3 examples, we'll look at them a bit more generically without using the fire doors specific application. Good practice is enough. That's what we've said for the previous slides. If you've identified a relevant standard or a suitable reference system and you apply that, you've done enough. You've satisfied reasonably practicable. You do not need to justify all the things that you have not done. This is a common misconception, and we get some crazy examples out there of people saying you can't be SFAIRP unless you've demonstrated all the things that you have not done. That's not required if you have complied with a relevant standard or a suitable reference system. Again, this is like example 3. Risk assessments don't overrule good practice. You may have had an example where there's a potential control and you could reduce the risks, but you've decided not to do it because, hey, we don't think it's worth it. However, there is a reference system in place which requires you to implement the controls of a standard, and you can't get out of that by saying it's just done a risk assessment. This doesn't fly. You can't just say, no, we're not doing it. You have to actually apply the good practice. That's the law. That's what is reasonably practicable. So if that good practice exists, it does not matter what your risk assessment says, you have to implement it because that's what is reasonably practicable in these cases. This is, again, another example we see a lot where people identify a solution, but then are not satisfied and keep going further and further. As we said previously, if there's good practice, you're required to implement it by the law. That's the reason practicable. So what happens? We get a situation where we've implemented that, we've done what we should have done, but someone comes along and says, hey, actually here, I think there's another control that we could implement here. I've done a risk assessment and I think it's reasonable. So they then say you must implement control A in order to be reasonably practicable. They've actually changed the bar of what this is. And this isn't the definition as required by the law anymore. This is the definition as applied by the individual who's trying to get it to do this. So do we do it again? Do we then say, actually, there's another control that we could implement? Surely it's reasonable we can implement that one. And we're moving that what is reasonably practical forward and edging it further along every time to get to a point of where do you actually stop? This is the example 2 of the fire doors. How many fire doors have we actually put in? Well, why should you be doing more than what your industry peers are doing? They're complying with the standards or they've got their reference systems that they're all applying to. Why should you do more? And ask yourself that every time when people are saying this, why should I do any more than what is reasonably practicable? I'll take this on a little bit further. This is a way that you can think about it in a way that we all use each day. Say there's a motorway, we're driving a motorway, there's a speed limit of 100 kph. That's the standard for what is reasonably practical. When it comes to driving on a motorway, you must be doing 100 kilometers per hour or less. But then we look at the reference systems, and the reference system here is actually pretty much everyone else driving on the motorway with us. They're mostly going to be driving between 90 and 100 kph on a good sunny day with moderate traffic. So we've got a kind of a good practice and good practice example here with a standard and a reference system by looking around our peers. If you're speeding, you have to slow down. You can't just be doing 125 and thinking you're doing what's the right thing here. You must slow down. That is the law. You should be driving under 100 kph. But why should you be going any slower than what the rest of the traffic is doing? There's no requirement for you to do that. Yes, it could theoretically be safer. You'd be doing a lower speed. You may consider that you being 10 minutes late for your appointment is fine, but that's something that you can choose to do. But the law's not requiring you to do that. You should be just keeping up with the traffic and driving as best you can. So next time you're on a motorway and you're driving at 100, ask yourself, why am I not driving at 80? Why am I not driving at 70? Why am I not driving at 60? Why should I not be driving slower? It's because you don't have to. The requirement here, the good practice, the standard in the reference systems is get in between that 90 and 100 kph and just do the same as other road users and keep the traffic moving to the same as everyone else. You're not required to do more by the law. You can choose to, but you're not required. When I look at this and I try to work out why, particularly in regards to the last example, people then keep doing that risk assessment and wanting lower and lower and lower. I think in Australia, it possibly comes back to the wording specifically in the legislation. Now, this isn't in the UK legislation. This is a summary of the case law. This is what's applied by the courts, but it's not specifically written down in this way. But so I think people read this and they go through, okay, I have to do a risk assessment. I have to identify the hazards. I have to look at ways of eliminating the risks and doing those things. And you do when you do a risk assessment, but actually when you consider the context of the law, this can actually be satisfied by using good practice. So you don't have to do this for every single hazard risk you identify. This is only when you've identified there's no good practice which would satisfy this requirement under the law do you then do the risk assessment in this way. So understanding the law is really important, but also understanding how the regulator applies the law and how you deal with the regulator and how that could result in a prosecution is quite important. Case law is assessed by the regulator. They prepare guidance that can be given externally to youth industries and guidance that they use internally for prosecutions. If you're complying with the regulator's guidance, they're not going to prosecute you or take you to court because they're happy that you're doing what is reasonably practicable. So the regulator's guidance is really, really important. And again, this is from the UK Health and Safety Executive, which really are the custodians of so far as is reasonably practicable and the law since it was introduced in 1974. They talk here about good practice. And again, if you've adopted good practice, and we're looking at the top quote here, it relieves you of the duty to take into account the individual risks because that was done when the good practice was established. So the requirements, as I say, of the legislation on the previous slide, they've been undertaken and assessed by the parties who determined what the good practice was. So you don't have to do it again. And again, following that through, those explicit evaluations of risk rarely need to be done in terms of day-to-day hazards because there's existing good practice which can be applied. As we get into system safety and complex systems or new and novel or high risk issues, then yeah, we have to do more to get to that point and do risk assessments because there's very rarely a single reference system that you can apply, and there's usually lots of standards. So as we get to high hazards, then we do more. But for most cases and most of what we're doing, all we have to do is comply with those relevant standards or those suitable reference systems. One of the things I get a lot in debate is people saying, hey, why is there no case law saying you should apply with good practice? And again, as I mentioned earlier, the regulator will have guidance on what to do when they bring a prosecution. And if they are happy that you're following good practice, they are happy that you're doing what is reasonably practicable, and they don't bring a prosecution around that. So we by saying where's the case law that says you should be following good practice, the fact that there is none means that the regulators haven't brought any prosecutions because everyone is following good practice in the way that makes them happy. The concept I've talked about on the previous slides, that's really simple to apply from a project where we're making a specific change at a point in time. We can see the standard that's relevant at the point in time. We can look around and see our industry peers. But what happens if we're not doing a project and we're looking at business as usual and are looking at our actual controls? So when we're looking at business as usual for this example, we're going to bring time into the equation. So we've put time along the bottom axis here. Say, for example, we're running a business and we built that business to standard version 1.0. At a point in the future, times may change, and we might find that that standard is now been updated and there's a new standard with more robust controls in place. So what is considered reasonably practicable has evolved over time, and we then have to consider, do we implement it standard version 2, or do we just implement standard version 2 for new projects, or do we slowly transition between those two? What is reasonably practicable has changed when the new standard has been issued. Similar again with reference systems. We initially determined where we were by comparing ourselves to company A, B, and C. We established what that reference system zone was for Reasonably Practicable. We're working in it, and that's what we've done as an organization. Now, over time, company A and company C have actually implemented new ways of working. They've actually now transitioned their organization through adopting new technologies, and this has now become what we consider the accepted industry practice. So what has become reasonably practical previously has now changed, and we have to look at that new benchmark that we put in place for reasonably practicable based on reference systems. Again, do we implement it immediately or do we implement it in a progressive way? Depends how easy it is. If it's a simple thing like, we're using drones instead of people, something you can implement next day. You're not going to go down and demolish your system and build a new one because the standards change. Again, it's about keeping an eye on what is considered the relevant standards and what is the suitable reference system. So you making sure that you're following good practice over time and making a conscious decision as to whether and when you are going to implement that new good practice or whether you'll have to stick with the previous version that you've got. So why can this zone change over time? As I said, standards are updated and released over time. You may transition to new standards. You may decide to stick with the old ones, but as long as you know what they are and you've taken the decision that's the right thing you can do, you can defend that position in the court of law. Reference systems, again, we know that drones have become widespread. Would using drones 10 years ago have been considered reasonably practical? Probably not. They were still experimental. Would using drones to do inspections now? I think you'd have a difficult job to say why you're not using them, particularly on certain, some structures like bridges or where things that are hard to access. New ways of working may have become commonplace. You may be adapting new shift changes. You may have trained your staff in a different way. What's changed in terms of the way that people work? And actually, the cost of previously rejected controls comes down a lot as well. So we might have done a risk assessment a few years ago to say we're not implementing this, but actually now it's a third of the price. We have to go back and reconsider that again. And another one here that's really important is the risk profile might change. New technologies increase the risk profile and different things may change the basis on which you made that decision all this time ago. A great example is the e-scooters on trains. Those batteries are setting on fire, and we're getting examples of whether we should be, do we put in technologies, do we ban them? We have to acknowledge the risk profile has changed, and therefore the controls that were absolutely reasonably practicable 10 years ago may not be suitable anymore because the risk has changed. And also you might be able to identify new failure modes. So as we be able to do more detailed scans or understand more complex ways of working, there might be failure modes that we hadn't really considered previously. So as a business organization, you have to make sure that you're keeping up to speed with what is good practice and making decisions as to whether and when you adopt them the way. So we're about done, folk. Those takeaways as usual. Reasonably practicable is a defined legal term. So FARP and ALARP are just different ways of showing the test is met. If anyone's telling you anything other than that, you need to tell them to stop. It's not opinion. It's not personal preferences. It's not the books that you bought. It's the definitions from the court. Most reasonably practical determinations are based on good practice. Explicit risk assessments, and that's including quantified risk assessments and cost benefit analysis, are by exception, only where there is no good practice that can be applied. If there is good practice, you must meet it. You can't say I'm not doing it because I've done a risk assessment. If that standard is there, you must comply with that standard. If that reference system is being applied by everyone else, you must do the same as everyone else. But conversely, you do not need to go beyond that. And again, that's one of the important things you need to know. You do not need to go into that orange zone. You have to be in the green zone. Once you're comfortable that you've satisfied reasonably practical, you can stop. There's no requirement under the law in any way, shape, or form for you to justify why you're not doing more. And again, finally, just remember that zone changes over time. So keep up to date on what is good practice and consciously make decisions whether to implement those changes or not, and write them down and document them because they're really important. I will call out Proving Safety by Greg Smith if you want to actually understand a lawyer's perspective and actually get into a huge amount of detail into what that means. And finally, folks, keep it simple. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. There are cases when it needs to be complicated, but for the vast majority of what you're doing and the vast majority of the risks that you're assessing, just to keep it simple, please. Thank you. I'll post some links in the chat below, and if you can obviously drop me a message on LinkedIn, feel free to do so, and thanks for listening.